I'm going to speak about the EU 2-degree climate protection target. In 1992, as I think Owen mentioned this morning, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. Its primary objective, its only objective, is to stabilise atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. What the challenge is for government is to put in policies that will take us off these trajectories. They need to do so very rapidly, though. As I say, it's non-mitigation scenarios. Just a few things that are hidden in this chart. There is a very high scenario up here. They don't have the line showing up, but the average temperature is about 4 degrees centigrade, and it goes way above the scale on the chart. That is the scenario that we're actually on now as a business as usual. We are really heading towards very high global temperatures. This other line at the bottom is very important as well. That was an experiment done by the modellers where they switched off emissions in 2000 and wanted to see what would happen to the global climate system. The temperature continues to increase at least to the end of this century, so we have at levels, concentrations at 2000 levels, we would have at least 1 degree of warming. At 450 ppm CO2 equivalent, there's a 50-50 chance of staying below 2C. Toss of the coin, effectively. Long life greenhouse gas atmospheric levels are at 450 CO2 equivalent. Cooling by other pollutants such as sulfates mean that we're effectively at 390 CO2 equivalent. The key message, we don't have much time really to sort this out. Concentrations typically are rising about 2 to 3 ppm per year. It says to stay at 450 ppm CO2 equivalent, we should reduce our emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020 and 80 to 95% by 2050.
Emissions to continue at a high rate, then this century we're going to see ice sheets begin to disintegrate. And one of the things I write about in my book is the effect that will have on storms, because as Greenland begins to release more fresh water, cold fresh water, and Antarctica does, what it does is cool the North Atlantic Ocean and the Southern Ocean, and that increases the temperature gradient between low latitudes and middle and high latitudes, and that will increase the strength of storms that are driven by horizontal temperature gradients. So our children can look forward to increasing storms, and with a rising sea level, that is going to lead potentially to a very chaotic situation, because once you have hundreds of cities in a situation analogous to what happened in New Orleans, then we've got an economic situation which is just out of control globally. Effect means once the planet gets warmer and warmer, then the oceans begin to evaporate, and water vapor is a very strong greenhouse gas, even more powerful than carbon dioxide. So you can get to a situation where the oceans will begin to boil, and the planet becomes so hot that the ocean ends up in the atmosphere. And that happened to Venus. You know, that's why Venus no longer has carbon in its surface. Its atmosphere is made up basically of carbon dioxide because it had a runaway greenhouse effect. We can't push the planet off of the runaway greenhouse end. That's the end for everybody if we do that.
Now, only a few weeks ago, Lord Stern, whose seminal report did so much to help us understand the financial cost of climate change, spelt out the threats. He said that wars, famines, floods, and hurricanes would wreak havoc unless greenhouse gas emissions were controlled. His view is that society has not even begun to understand the extent of the problem. He predicted that a 4 or 5 degree rise over the next 100 years, which is now looking more likely unless urgent action is taken, would result in collapses in crop yields, rivers drying up, and perhaps billions, yes, billions of people being forced to leave their homes. And what would be the implication of that? In Lord Stern's own words, extended social conflict, social disruption, war essentially, over much of the world for many decades. I said when I was in Brazil just 2 months ago that we had 100 months left in which to take the necessary action to avoid this awful outcome. And this was based on the assumption that globally we must see our carbon emissions peaking by then to avoid tipping over into catastrophic climate change. And this isn't my assumption. This is what the scientific experts are telling us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, time has moved on, and we now have 98 months left. And every week, that doomsday countdown continues with remorseless inevitability. And if this isn't bad enough, then remember that every year, and sometimes monthly, scientists are having to recalibrate their own predictions because the speed with which climate change is occurring is increasing all the time. We are literally in uncharted territory.
I want to quote you something from Elizabeth May. What path is the best way to get global agreements to stop greenhouse gases from rising by 2015? Because if we don't do that one thing, nothing else matters.
Bizarre, given my background as a grassroots activist, that I was asked to join the political staff of the Federal Minister of Environment in the Mulroney years. I mean,
what are the odds of that?
Yeah, you can't plan for a thing like that because it's so unlikely. But it was a great experience, and one of the things that, going there, having a history of fighting, as we've talked about, forest spray issues, nuclear power. Climate change was not one of the issues that I even knew about very much. I'd worked on acid rain, aware of ozone depletion, but I was being given the top-notch scientific briefings because I attended all the sessions that my boss did with departmental officials. And the briefings on the science of climate change in 1986 were enough to scare the life out of me. And this was when we were still talking about there was never any doubt in the scientists' advice in terms of the fact that you add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, you're destabilizing global climate. None of this was ever in any kind of doubt. But I can remember them saying by 2030 we could see the glaciers in retreat. Oh my God, the glaciers have been in retreat for the last decade. They're in retreat in the Rockies, the Himalayas, the Andes. The Drake glaciers are in retreat globally. And the ice cap melting, this is all much faster than the scientists had been saying back in '86. And so the science gets more and more robust, the warnings get clearer, and governments are still playing this game of, oh, well, maybe next time, or, there's only so much we can do without harming our economy. We are looking at a window that's closing. And the window that's closing is closing on our opportunity to make a transition away from fossil fuels, to do it in a way that's beneficial for society, and to do it sufficiently quickly and aggressively that we can avoid the worst case scenarios of the climate crisis. We can no longer avoid the fact that we've changed the atmosphere. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. We're in a period of climatic disruption. We're going to be facing, if you turn on the nightly news, it may have dawned on people that it didn't used to be the case that every night brought a new natural disaster story. It looks like a sci-fi adventure. It's the forest fires brush fires in Australia, or forest fires in California, or shrinking Arctic ice, or unprecedented flooding. This is the world as we have made it, and it's going to continue in this way for some considerable time. And this is looking at the science, looking at rising atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, and knowing that to avoid runaway global warming, we need to ensure that we stop the rise in greenhouse gases no later than 2016. And I'm not saying how fast you have to bring them down, but we've got to stop the increase by 2016.
Gwynne Dyer is an expert on war, and not just the battlefields, but the sources and causes of international conflict. You take it as a given that climate change is happening, and faster than expected, and that the first and most important impact will be an acute and permanent crisis of food supply.
Yeah.
Why, and what are the implications? Why do you say that, and what follows from that?
Well, I say that because the scientists say it and the generals say it. That's why the generals are interested, is because they see the primary consequence in the early and middle stages of climate change before it gets completely out of control, if it ever does, but even you know, 1 degree, 2 degrees hotter, you're already in trouble on the food supply. And it's very striking that just as generally among governments, they have no doubts about the science. I mean, the whole questioning of the scientific basis is a public and a public relations function, a sort of media campaign, well-financed, which particularly in North America has been successful in undermining the credibility of the scientific evidence among the general public. But people in government are not vulnerable to that to the same extent at all. There's not a single government that refused to sign the declaration last July, was it, at the last big summit, G8 summit, saying, you know, the goal is to prevent ever going past 2 degrees hotter than the 1990 datum. You know, the Americans signed, the British, the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese, and the Chinese and Indians and Brazilians and the Australians. I think even Canada signed. So at that level, there's you know, this is over, and it's actually been over for a long time. Likewise, the notion that food supply is going to become a major issue, over. I mean, 3 years ago, the World Bank started letting a series of contracts to think tanks around the world. Please calculate how much your country will lose in terms of food production at 2 degrees hotter. I happened to stumble across the Indian think tank that had come to that, got that contract, and the director there told me what she'd told the World Bank and the end of the contract, which was India loses 25% at 2 degrees hotter. Now, very interestingly, those reports have not been published. The World Bank is sitting on them because the governments involved do not want that information out in public. But they don't doubt it.
You are rich. We are poor. You seem well fed. We are hungry. You have been victorious. We have been defeated. You have valuable colonies. We have none. You have your navy. Where is ours? You have had the past. Let us have the future. Above all, I fear they would say, you are weak and we are strong. After all, my friends, only a few hours away by air, there dwells a nation of nearly 70 million of the most educated, industrious, scientific, disciplined people in the world, who are being taught from childhood to think of war as a glorious exercise and death in battle as the noblest fate for man. There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective strength. There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion. In that country, all pacifist speeches, all morbid war books are forbidden or suppressed. Now, these are facts, hard, grim, indisputable facts. And in face of these facts, I ask again, what are we to do?
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.